And welcome back to another recorded lecture. This one will be on 5.2, which is on perfectly competitive factor markets. And we'll be talking about how firms make decisions to maximize profit and minimize costs in production. Before we get started, I want to remind you to make sure you're actively listening and taking notes while you're following along with the recording, and make sure to pause the recording whenever you need more time to digest the content. And without further ado, I am your host, Mr. Kmos, and we're going to dive right into the second lesson of Unit 5. Now, this might look familiar from Units 3 and 4, but just like product markets have a spectrum of competitiveness, economists like to categorize factor markets the same way. Because just like we want competition in product markets for goods and services, we also want competition regarding resources and inputs. And so we're going to be starting over on the far left with perfectly competitive factor markets, and then we will move into monopsony, which is basically a monopoly for labor or factors of production in 5.3. And just like all of our market structures from Units 3 and 4, there are different characteristics that you're going to need to know of perfectly competitive factor markets. I'm going to remind you, though, that I'm going to be talking about all of this in the context of labor markets because that's the most common example for AP. And so here are the characteristics. There are many, many small firms all hiring workers. In other words, buying resources. And you could see a question on a resource other than labor, but again, it's simpler to just talk about this in the context of one resource at a time. And so what this means is that no firm is large enough to manipulate the market, right? They're all going to be competing for labor. They're all going to be competing for the same pool of workers, you could say, and that makes it perfectly competitive. There are also many workers with identical skills, right? So lots and lots of workers in the market, and they all have pretty similar skill sets. And the wage is going to be constant or perfectly elastic, and you will see that in a moment when we draw the model for the firm. And because the wage is going to be set by a perfectly competitive free labor market, workers are going to be wage takers. Which means that they are not going to have a say over the wage that they are paid. But on the flip side of this, firms will also be wage takers in a way, because they will have to charge or pay, the wage that the market sets to their workers. And so this means that firms can hire as many workers as they want at the wage set by the industry. And that might be a little confusing for you, but microeconomists will still refer to markets for resources like labor or land or capital as industries in and of themselves. So you'll see that as well. So we've drawn the market for factor of production or a resource. Here we have the market for labor. We've got the wage on the y-axis, the quantity of labor on the x-axis, and we've learned all about the demand and supply of factors or resources. But over on the right, I have a big question mark because that model is for the firm, and we haven't actually talked about how to draw a model for the firm when we're looking at a factor market or a resource market. And so just like we drew side-by-side graphs for perfectly competitive markets, we're going to be drawing side-by-side graphs for perfectly competitive factor markets, just like the product markets. But before we do that, let's go through the firm's supply and demand for the factors of production, because there are a couple of key concepts or terms that we're going to need to dissect before we can actually draw the model. And so this model that we're building is going to be essentially the other side of the production function, where at the beginning of Unit 3, if you can remember back to late November, December, when we talked about production for the first time, we did talk about resources, but we were mainly focused on maximizing output, right, and the different stages of production. But now we're going to be applying all of that to the other side, which is what firms are using to produce. And so here we have to, it's very important for us to review the law of diminishing marginal returns, because this is going to play a key role in the firm's production function and their acquisition of factors of production. And so here I've got a little table. We've got the quantity of output And then we've got the marginal revenue and the marginal product. And notice that the marginal revenue in a perfectly competitive market is constant at $5 because firms are price takers in perfect competition. And so the marginal revenue will be equal to the price. And then we have the marginal product, and we see the marginal product begins to go up, and then it reaches a peak, and then it begins to go down, and then it will turn negative. And so these are the stages of production. And if we apply this concept to a factor market, the stages of production are affected by also the cost of resources. In this case, our marginal revenue is not going to be the price of a product, but it will be the price of a resource. And I'm using wage as the example, and this is set by the factor market. And so marginal product is going to increase, just like we learned back in Unit 3, and that will eventually lead to the law of diminishing marginal returns. And so marginal product increases because of specialization, then it begins to decrease because there are too many workers and they're bumping into each other. Remember, too many cooks in the kitchen. And then eventually it will turn into negative returns, where a firm could hire more workers and it could actually lead to less production, less marginal output for that additional worker. And so here's our marginal product curve. We already learned this back in Unit 3, but as we add units of labor or a variable resource, eventually the marginal product will increase, reach a peak, and then decrease, and then turn negative. And so when we apply this concept to a firm and its resources that it's using for production, we call this marginal revenue product. And so essentially we're looking at the additional revenue generated by an additional worker's output, or output from any resource. It could be something else other than workers, but we're going to talk about workers. And in a perfectly competitive factor market, the marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal revenue times the marginal product. And so you could think of this as the total, the marginal revenue, or the benefit of additional units of output from an additional worker. And so the marginal revenue product is going to be equal to a firm's demand for labor. And so that's just a general rule. And if we were to fill out the last column of this table, which you should in your notes, you'll see that we just get the marginal revenue product by multiplying the marginal revenue by the marginal product. Okay, so marginal revenue being the wage from the perfectly competitive market, which is also going to be similar in concept to the price being constant throughout a perfectly competitive market. And so there's another way to calculate marginal revenue product, which is our first major concept regarding the firm here in factor markets. And here's your equation for marginal revenue product: change in total revenue divided by change in inputs. Or in other words, we're looking at the change in the quantity of a resource or an input. And so I'm giving you this equation as well because sometimes AP will give you a question like we just saw in the table, where they'll give you the marginal revenue, they'll give you the marginal product, and then you can calculate the MRP or the marginal revenue product from that. Sometimes they'll give you these values. So total revenue, change in total revenue, change in inputs, and then you can still calculate the marginal revenue product. But essentially, we're just looking at the change in revenue to the firm as a result of a change in workers hired. The second concept that we need to understand for the firm is marginal resource cost. Okay, and here we're looking at the additional costs of an additional resource for a firm. And so in this case, it would be the worker. This is also called marginal factor costs, which sometimes confuses people. If we even go back to marginal revenue product, a lot of people look at MRP and they say, oh, marginal resource product. That's not actually the acronym, right? Don't get the R confused. For MRC, it is marginal resource cost. For MRP, it is marginal revenue product. That's very important that you keep those in mind. But AP will use MFC, or marginal factor cost, sometimes. So you need to know both. And so in perfectly competitive labor markets, a firm's marginal resource cost is equal to the wage set by the market and is constant. So this will be perfectly elastic. And you'll see what this looks like graphically in a moment. But we already said firms are wage takers in perfect competition. And just like with MRP, there is a second way that you can calculate MRC, and that is change in total costs divided by change in inputs. So with marginal revenue product, we're looking at revenue. With marginal resource cost, we're looking at cost. And so if you just remember that, the two sets of equations should be pretty easy to memorize and then use. So the rule for profit maximizing quantity of a resource, and in this case I have labor, but remember there's an asterisk because it could be capital, it could be land, whatever. But the rule is very, very important. And so in order for a firm to determine how many resources they should employ or hire or purchase, a firm will continue to hire until the marginal revenue product equals the marginal resource cost. And that is like the golden rule of Unit 5, right? No, I would say over half of all Unit 5 questions have something to do with this rule. So if you remember this rule, you're going to be in a good place. Now, let's go through an example. Okay, we're going to say that you're the boss of a company. And so you own your own business, and you are going to be selling a good in a perfectly competitive product market, and the price is $10. And that means the price is going to be $10 regardless of how much quantity you produce, because in a perfectly competitive market, we have Mr. Dart, where marginal revenue equals demand equals average revenue equals price, and price is the price of the product. And so then we're also going to assume that you are hiring workers in a perfectly competitive resource market. So everything's perfectly competitive. And so this means that the wage is going to be perfectly competitive and constant at $15. So it doesn't matter how many workers you employ to produce whatever quantity of output, the wage for each worker is going to be $15. And so we're going to assume for simplicity's sake that the only cost that you are assuming as a firm is the wage, and that is $15. And so in order to maximize profit, how many workers should you hire? All right, well, I already told you we're going to hire where the MRP equals the MRC, or the marginal revenue product equals the marginal resource cost. However, you don't have enough information in order to calculate this right now. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to do some math. And I'm going to walk you through a table with explanation, and this will be sort of like some data that or numbers that AP could provide you on a question, and you could answer things like this. They're not going to give you a full table like I'm going to give you. They'll give you parts of it, and then you'll have to do the proper calculations to answer the question. But we're going to go through everything. And of course, some of you probably are ruining the day that you have to do math. But remember, if you own a business, you're going to be doing math. So you got to make sure you can do basic arithmetic. But I'm going to walk you through it. I want you to turn your notes horizontally, and you're going to draw quite a big table because we're going to be adding lots of things on here. I only have 2 things at first, and I'm going to be walking you through each things. And in the vein of our example, with the price being $10 for your product and the wage being $15 for every worker that you're employing, now I have given you the units of labor that you're going to use, or the possible units of labor, and then the total product or output that each quantity of labor would be able to produce. And so we see here, if you employ 2 workers, you would produce a total output of 17. If you have 4 workers, it would be 27, so on and so forth. And so if you think about how much each worker is worth, we can't just look at the total product. We have to look at the marginal product. And we've done this before. And so in order to find the marginal product, you're just going to take the difference between the total products as we increase units of output. Remember, marginal product, you could also calculate it as change in total product divided by change in units of labor, which you might have to use that equation, which you already learned a while ago. But in this case, we don't have to use the equation because the units of labor are increasing at a constant rate of 1. And so if we look at the marginal product and we analyze it as we go through, we can see the total product is showing us the stages of returns, right, that we just reviewed. And so we already discussed that this occurs because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. It occurs because of specialization, and then increasing inefficiency until returns actually become negative. And so we can identify the three stages here. The first stage is going from 1 unit of labor all the way up until 6, and then the next would be the first stage of labor is or marginal product is happening between units of labor 1 and 2, and then the marginal product begins to decrease, and so we see eventually after the 7th worker is hired, there's actually negative marginal product. And so that's marginal product, and you see the difference between 0 and 7 is 7, 7 and 17 is 10, and so on and so forth. And so this marginal product point shows the productivity of each worker. So we're looking at each individual worker's additional product when they are hired. And so we already discussed why productivity decreases. That's the law of diminishing marginal returns. I'm going to keep repeating that because it's very important. It could come up. Then we're going to add the product price here. And remember, this is a perfectly competitive market. So the product price is going to be $10 every time. It's not going to change. So it doesn't matter how many units of labor the firm is employing, how much product they're producing, the price per unit of the good is still going to be $10. And so price is constant because we are in a perfectly competitive market. And now we can calculate the marginal revenue product, which remember is the product, the marginal product times the price. And so you see that I've done this here. 7 times 10, 70, 10 times 10 is 100, so on and so forth. And so notice that the marginal revenue product is going to move in the same direction as marginal product. Okay, so it's going to go up and then down and then eventually turn negative. And so now the last thing that we can calculate is marginal resource cost. Okay, and marginal resource cost is $15 every single time. Each additional worker is going to be paid a wage of $15. And so if we have the marginal revenue product, which is showing us the value added to the firm of each worker hired, and then we have the marginal resource cost, which is the additional cost that the firm has to pay for hiring an additional worker, we can now use our rule to determine how many workers a firm should hire. In this example, if we look at the table, we can see that eventually we get to a point where marginal revenue product decreases, but is not less than marginal resource cost. And so this firm would hire a quantity of 5 workers. And so that is because in this example, we're not going to get to a point where MRP equals MRC. And so we definitely don't want the marginal resource cost to be greater than the marginal revenue product or the value added to the firm of that fifth worker. And so the firm is not going to hire the 6th worker because the MRC is greater than the MRP. And so they will stop at 5, where MRP is 20 and the MRC is 15. And so this is the rule that you must remember. The firm will always hire or employ a resource up until the point where MRP equals MRC. Now that we've discussed that, we can draw the second half of our perfectly competitive labor market. And so we're going to do this now. We'll draw the firm individually by itself, and then we will connect the firm to the perfectly competitive market. And so here is the individual firm in a factor market. And so we're going to have our supply of labor and our demand for labor by the firm, by this individual firm. And you notice that in this model, we're going to say that supply for the firm is equal to the firm's marginal resource cost, and the demand for the firm is equal to the firm's marginal revenue product. And just a couple of notes that you can annotate around your model. Remember, the wage is set by the factor market, and the wage is the supply of labor, which is also the marginal resource cost. And so that is why it is perfectly elastic, because the wage is set by the factor market as a whole, the whole industry for labor, but the firm in a perfectly competitive resource market is going to have to charge, or is going to have to pay workers the wage set by the market. And so that's the marginal resource cost. It does not change as quantity changes. However, then we have the firm's demand curve for labor, and this is also called the marginal revenue product, and this is going to decrease as the quantity of workers increases. Okay, as the quantity of workers increases. And so now you'll see lots of questions if it talks about graphing factor markets, where you're going to have to draw side-by-side graphs for a perfectly competitive labor market and a firm hiring workers in that perfectly competitive market. And so we're going to draw side-by-side graphs. So new graphs. We have our supply and demand for labor in the labor industry, in the factor market. We have the equilibrium wage rate, and we have the quantity of labor in the market. And then we have the individual firm who is going to take that wage from the factor market, and that will become the marginal resource cost, because every additional worker will cost the same amount. And that is the supply of labor for the firm. And then we have the demand curve for the individual firm, where it is downward sloping, because as the firm increases the quantity of labor, the marginal revenue product of each worker will begin to decrease. And so we see that with the downward sloping demand curve, and that is representing the law of diminishing marginal returns. And so you'll see plenty of questions where it asks for you to draw the two side-by-side graphs. The hardest thing here is just to remember that we are not talking about a product, and so the quantity there for that individual firm is the quantity of the resource they are employing, or they are purchasing, or they are demanding, and the price of that resource is the wage that they will pay the workers, or whatever the price of that resource is that the firm has to pay. And so now we're going to go through a couple of examples, and on your graphs, and if you need more time you can pause the video, but on your graphs you're going to show the change on your own. You're going to pause the video, answer the question, and then I will go over it. So the question is, what happens to the wage and the quantity of labor in the market and for the firm if new workers enter the industry, right? So if new workers enter the labor market as a whole, how is that going to impact the labor market, and then how is that going to consequently impact the individual firm? So if new workers enter the labor market, that means the supply of labor is going to increase and shift to the right. And so we're going to have our shift to the right in the supply of labor. I have it labeled as SL2. You could just label it as S2 if you want. But when more workers enter the labor market, that's going to decrease the equilibrium wage, right? Just like price would move in a product market, the wage, which is the price for that resource, is going to decrease. And so because the firm is operating in a perfectly competitive market, the supply of labor for the firm is also going to decrease. And so now we have a new supply curve, or new marginal resource cost curve for the individual firm. And so now it's going to be cheaper for that firm to hire more workers, to employ more labor, and that means the quantity of labor the firm is employing is going to increase. And so notice here I have the supply and demand curve still labeled as MRC and MRP for the individual firm. That will be standard practice for the individual firm in the factor market. Now, a common question that you will see AP ask is they'll talk about marginal revenue product, and they'll ask you what happened to the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired. And so if we're analyzing just MRP, remember this is the value added to the firm when they hire an additional worker. And so even though, of course, the firm is going to want to hire more workers if there's a lower wage, the value of that additional worker is actually going to decrease. In this case, it is because when they hire more workers, even if it's worth it for them, even if the wages decrease, that additional worker is still not going to add as much value as the previous workers, because our marginal revenue product curve is downward sloping for the individual firm. And so this is sort of a tricky thing for some people to wrap their heads around, but just remember that demand or marginal revenue product is downward sloping. We have the law of diminishing marginal returns, which means that if the wage decreases and the firm increases the quantity of labor that they employ, the additional benefit to the firm for hiring the additional worker is still going to decrease, even though on the model everything looks like it's increasing, but it's not, because the MRP is downward sloping. Here's another question. Draw new graphs this time, so 2 new graphs. And on those 2 new graphs, I want you to answer this question. What would happen to the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired if this individual firm increased its demand for labor? And so now we're not talking about a change in the market for labor or the whole industry. Rather, we're just talking about a change with this individual firm's demand for labor. And so take a moment, draw the graphs, figure out how the marginal revenue product is going to change, and then we will go over it. Okay, so remember, there's no change in this example to the actual labor market or the industry, but the firm is going to be increasing its demand for labor, and so we're going to show this with a new demand curve where the firm's demand curve or marginal revenue product increases and shifts to the right. However, remember that the firm in a perfectly competitive factor market is a wage taker. They are going to pay their workers the wage set by the perfectly competitive factor market. And so because the wage didn't change, because the supply of labor didn't change, the firm is going to be demanding more labor, but the marginal revenue product is not necessarily, or the marginal revenue product of the additional workers is not necessarily changing. And so the MRP is going to be constant. It is not going to change. The marginal revenue product of that additional worker did not change because the supply of labor did not change. The wage did not change. And so this is a very tricky way for AP to ask this question, but the marginal revenue product would stay the same as long as the supply of labor or the market equilibrium wage stays the same. And so now we've been talking about labor all this time, but labor is not the only factor of production that firms employ. Firms use all 3 of the major factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And so what you'll see often on AP questions is questions about combining resources. But we have to figure out how to maximize profit, right, or minimize costs by combining 2 different resources with 2 different prices. And so what we're going to do is very similar actually to what we did during consumer choice theory at the end of Unit 1, when we calculated utility maximization of consumers, and how, remember, consumers had a certain amount of income, and then they were dividing their income between 2 different goods with 2 different prices in order to maximize utility. This is very similar to that. We are only talking now about firms purchasing resources instead of consumers purchasing goods. And so before we go any further, I just want to sort of give you an outline of what the next couple of minutes are going to entail. We have 4 major equations for factor markets, and we've already talked about one, which is just our profit maximizing rule for one resource, and that's MRP equals MRC, marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost. That is where the firm will determine what quantity of a resource they will employ. But now the rest of the equations, the last 3, we're going to be applying to this concept of combining different resources and the firm maximizing profit by employing or purchasing the optimal quantity of resources for their production process. And so here is our next equation, the marginal product per dollar. And so this looks very similar to the marginal utility per dollar question equation that we had for consumer choice theory, but it is simply just the marginal product of a firm divided by the price of the resource. Okay, and so this is just showing us how much additional output per dollar spent on a resource. And so we're going to use this equation now, but we're going to go through one other real quick, and that is the least cost rule. And so here we have the marginal product per dollar of one resource equal to the marginal product per dollar of the other resource. And so a good or resource X and resource Y is representing 2 different ones. We're going to do an example in a moment where you'll see labor and capital, so you could see these with actual factors of production or specific resources used. But this is the least cost rule, and the goal of this rule is to minimize input costs in order to maximize profit. And so this is very common on Unit 5 questions. And it looks intimidating, but it really is just the marginal product divided by the price of one resource equaling the marginal product of the other resource divided by the price of the other resource. And once they're equal, the firm is minimizing input costs. And so I want you to draw this table. And so we have a very simplistic example, but we have robots and workers, and we have units of each resource, so 1 through 4. And I've provided the prices of these resources. Robots are $10 each, workers are $5 each, and that would be the wage for the worker. And so we could now calculate the marginal utility per dollar of each unit of each resource. And so go ahead and do that. Okay, so our equation for the marginal product per dollar of each resource is just MP divided by P, or the marginal product divided by the price. And so I have here, if you have $35, what combination of robots and workers would maximize output? Now, you should have calculated all of these already. And in order to answer this question, I'll go back, this question of how many robots and how many workers this firm should employ to maximize output and to minimize costs, in order to do this, we have to use the least cost rule. And so we're going to put the marginal product per dollar of each resource equal to each other, and we're going to figure out how many robots and how many workers this firm should employ. If we go through this table, you can look at it visually and see one after the other, what the benefit of each one would be. And so I have the answers here for the marginal product per dollar, and we're going to go back and forth. And so if we look at the first unit, okay, the first worker is going to add more marginal product per dollar because 4 is greater than 3. So we're going to hire one worker, and then we look and see the next worker is $5, and that worker is adding 3. The first robot is $10, and it's also adding 3 marginal product per dollar. And so this firm is going to hire the second worker, which has a marginal product per dollar of 3, and then the first robot, which has a marginal product per dollar of 3 as well. And so then we can continue this and go all the way until $35, adding the $5 for the worker and the $10 for the robot, and we see that the profit maximizing, or the least cost rule, the cost minimizing quantities of robots and workers are 2 robots and 3 workers. And this gets us to $35. Now, all we did was look at the table and go logically one by one to see which combination maximized output for the firm while minimizing costs. And we basically just used this equation where the marginal product per dollar of robots is equal to the marginal product per dollar of workers. Now, using this equation, we can actually do some algebra. And the algebra is going to be very, very simple, but occasionally AP will give you a question where they'll already assume that a firm is operating using the least cost rule. Okay, so you won't actually have to find everything. You will just have to solve for one variable in the equation. And you have to think about it conceptually as you do the algebra. And so you'll just have to work backwards a little bit. Here is the example we're going to do together. And I've provided the marginal product of labor, which is MP sub L, and that is 75. The price of labor, which is $15. And then the marginal product of capital is 125. But you are going to solve for the price of capital. And so you're going to assume that the firm is utilizing the least cost rule that you just learned to employ labor and capital. Sorry, that's a typo. I don't know why it says A capital. And that you're going to solve for the price of capital. And so I'm going to give you a moment to attempt this on your own with algebra, and then we will go over it. Okay, so hopefully you were able to attempt this, and your algebra is being brought back to the forefront of your brain. But we're going to first begin by calculating the marginal product per dollar of labor because we have all the information. And so we can do 75 divided by $15, that's the marginal product divided by the price of labor, and that gives us a marginal product per dollar of 5 for labor. But we can't use that same equation necessarily for capital because we don't have the price. However, we know if this firm is using the least cost rule, then that means that the marginal product per dollar of the labor that they're employing is going to be equal to the marginal product per dollar of the capital they were employing. And so what we can do is we can set this up so that the marginal product for capital is also 5, which is what we calculate the marginal product per dollar of labor to be. And so knowing that, we can now do the little cross multiplication with algebra, and we can solve for x, which is the price of capital. And so we know the equation for marginal product per dollar of capital, it would be the marginal product, which is 125, divided by the price of capital, which we don't know, so that's going to be x, and that's going to equal 5. And when you do the cross multiplication and you solve for x, you get the price of capital equaling $25. And so that would be your answer. Notice here, it's still the least cost rule. It's still the same concepts. You're just going in and doing a little algebra in order to solve for the price. Okay, now we have one more equation that we need to cover, and this is the profit maximizing rule for combining resources. So we just went over the least cost rule, which is the rule that a firm uses to maximize output and minimize costs. But we can apply these same concepts in order to determine how a firm should maximize profit by employing certain quantities of resources. And here is your equation. You're going to put the marginal revenue product of the first resource, of resource X, divided by the marginal resource cost of resource X, and that will equal the marginal revenue product of the second resource, resource Y in this case, divided by the marginal resource cost of resource Y, and this should all equal 1. Each one should equal 1. And a couple things to keep in mind here. If the firm is hiring where MRP equals MRC, that means the firm is maximizing profit, and they're employing the quantity of each resource X and Y that allows them to maximize profit. Remember that the marginal resource cost is just the price of the resources, so occasionally you will see on AP questions, instead of them say marginal resource cost, they will just say the price of capital or the price of labor, whatever it is, but they're the same thing. And 2 rules that you need to remember using this equation or this rule. If you do the math and marginal revenue product divided by marginal resource cost is greater than 1, then the firm would benefit from hiring more of that resource, because that means that there's room for revenue, right? There's room for the firm to make more revenue for an additional worker. And so that would mean the marginal revenue product is greater than the marginal resource cost. Now, on the other side of that, if the marginal revenue product divided by the marginal resource cost is less than 1, then that means the firm is employing too much of that resource, right? That means the law of diminishing marginal returns is set in. That means the firm could be more efficient and maximize profit in a better way by actually employing less of that resource. And so now we're going to do a couple of examples with this that I've taken from previous year's AP micro multiple choice questions. And so I'm going to give you the questions. I want you to take a moment, figure out your answers, use the profit maximizing rule for combining resources, and we will go over each one. Okay, question number 1. Here we've got, for all these questions, we have the marginal revenue product of labor and the marginal revenue product of capital, and then the prices of labor and capital. And it's your job to figure out if the firm should hire more, hire less, or stay put and maintain the current level. And so with the first one, you would put 15 over 6 for the marginal product per dollar of labor, equaling the 10 over 10, which is the marginal product per dollar of capital. And this would show us that we could actually have 2.5 equaling 1, which means that this firm could benefit from hiring more labor. And so we would say more labor, but on the capital side, 10 over 10 equals 1. We already have as much capital as this firm needs. 1 is what we want. Remember, all sides of this equation are going to equal 1. And so capital, we'd stay put. We wouldn't hire anymore. For the second question here, you would put 5 over 10 for labor, which gives you 0.5, and 0.5 is less than 1, so that means this firm probably would benefit from hiring less labor. However, on the other side, we would put 10 over 15, MRP, divided by MRC, or price, and this gives us about 0.67, and that means this firm should probably also hire less capital. Number 3, you're going to do MRP over MRC, or price. Remember, they're equal, and that would be 25 divided by 20. That means that 1.25 is greater than 1. That means this firm should definitely hire more labor because the marginal revenue product per dollar, or the marginal product per dollar, is greater than 1. However, over on the other side, 15 over 15 is 1, so the firm has plenty of capital. They don't need to hire anymore. They're maximizing profit at the current quantity. Number 4, we have a marginal revenue product of labor, which is $12, and the price of labor, which is $12. 12 divided by 12 is 1, so this firm is maximizing profit with their quantity of labor. However, 50 divided by 40 is 1.25, which means this firm should probably hire more capital because they would benefit, right? The marginal product per dollar of capital is greater than 1. And then finally, we have number 5, 20 divided by 15 gives us a number greater than 1, 1.25 again, and so this means the firm should hire or employ more workers, but 100 divided by 40 is also greater than 1. That gives us 2.5, and so the firm should hire more capital. And so AP will ask questions similar to these on multiple choice. Don't get distracted with wording or anything else. You focus on our rules that we learned, right? Our profit maximizing rule, our least cost rule, our rules in this lesson will guide you through all of the calculations you need to do for Unit 5. And with that, we have concluded 5.2. You now know how to calculate combining resources and maximizing production and profit and minimizing costs using resources in a perfectly competitive market. Next lesson, we will be learning about monopsony, which is the monopoly for a resource. And I'll see you next time.